Hello and welcome to Sustain, the podcast where we talk about sustaining open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? What is my statistically most likely sentence to go after those questions? I've never thought about that. I find that really interesting. I'm your host, of course, Richard Littauer. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here, he said. Not joined by any other hosts today. If you want to ping them and let them know they should be on the podcast more, that'd be great. Why don't you suggest yourself to the podcast too? But I am joined by a guest, which is really exciting. Devin Stein is joining me today from California. Devin is the CEO of Dosu, calling in from, it looks like cloudy San Francisco. Judging by the shape of that tree, maybe it's the mission, but really, I don't know. Devin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Richard. And your guess was pretty good. It's actually a sunny day in San Francisco. And we're just north of the mission, like between the mission and Hayes Valley. So very close.
It's hard to tell. The reflection of the window is what I'm going off of your whiteboard. I love San Francisco. It's a nice place to live. So, Devin, CEO, founder of Dosu, proud of Dosu. You were an early engineer and a leader at various startups. You're also an active open source contributor, which is probably one of the reasons we have you on this podcast. And you're a maintainer of Spark Magic, SOPs, and KSOPs. That's SOPS, all caps. So first off, what does SOP stand for?
Secret Operations.
What does that do?
It's a tool for encrypting and decrypting files.
That's cool. Tell me about Dosu. What does Dosu do? What's your elevator pitch?
The elevator pitch for Dosu is we help engineering teams automate support and maintenance of software. And we do this by structuring existing engineering knowledge, so code, commits, and conversations, into a living knowledge base that we can then automate workflows on top of. So in open source, to make it more concrete, that looks like helping answer common questions, deduplicating issues, helping triage issues, find out who owns what, and those common types of questions that come up within open source maintenance.
Thank you. That was really on point and clear. We've already talked before. We had a pre-podcast meetup because you were suggested by Melissa Logan, who is awesome. Melissa has been on this podcast before. You should go check out her episode. It was episode 61 on making open source effectively and sustainably. One of the things I was listening for in your 5-minute spiel, which I didn't get, was AI or LLMs. Can you tell me what living code base means for you?
Dosu, like a core piece of what we do is using LLMs in the context of open source maintenance. That kind of goes to why I started Dosu. The realization I had almost 2 years ago, I started the company in June of 2023, was that there was a lot of focus on LLM's ability to generate code. I've been a longtime user of Copilot, still am, I really love it. But when I thought about where I spent my time, both as a senior engineer and as an open source maintainer, a lot of my time was spent on more engineering knowledge work, which was people pinging me with questions or issues that they needed my context I had about this project I maintain or how it's changed over time, what went into this release, what has changed recently. Is this a known issue that they're running into? Is there a workaround? And these types of questions and workflows felt really well suited for LLMs because LLMs can help structure unstructured information. They're really good at that. They're really effective at search. So given the right tools, you can build something that has a better memory than any one person. And maintainers' memories is an incredible, valuable thing. And then unlike maintainers, they're always on. They're machines. And I think open source is inherently very global and always on, and automation is actually able to meet that requirement in a way that maintainers typically struggle with.
I haven't used Copilot. My understanding of Copilot is that it helps generate code in the sense that while you're coding, it'll be like, you probably want this, throw this function in, and it'll give you what that function looks like, having scraped the entire GitHub database semi-legally. Hard to say, hasn't really gone to courts yet, and then gives you back what statistically is most likely. Now, you're saying that your code is always on when you're asleep. That means you're not generating code unless you're coding in your sleep, which is awesome. Tell me how you do that. Does this mean that the work that you're doing with Dosu, the tool itself, is also externally focused? So it responds to open source contributors?
Exactly. So we're much more focus on the workflows outside of the IDE. So within open source, that's typically GitHub issues, GitHub discussions, or like Slack and Discord. Enterprises look similarly, but more so in Slack and Jira.
Tell me how many users you have.
So Dosu interacts with tens of thousands of people per month in terms of people on open source. And then our install base, we're installed in over 26,000 projects, but the open source is a long tail. So there's, I would say, about 1,000 kind of like prominent active open source projects using Dosu.
Cool. When you say interact with 10,000 people, I mean, sort of the people who took down the Internet Archive. I mean, it could have been one person sending it to DOS, but like around 1,000 projects.
And then their community.
Yeah. I'm actually curious about Dosu itself. You're the CEO. How many people are on staff?
We're a team of 8 right now.
Cool. And are you VC funded or?
We are venture backed. Yes, we raised 9.5 million.
Cool. How long have you been in the business?
Almost a year and a half now.
Cool. I have a lot of questions about this. I want to make sure I have all the context before I dive in too much. I guess going off the last question, what's your capitalization plan?
It's actually been really interesting when talking to maintainers. It's almost always one of the first questions they ask. It's like, this sounds amazing. We love the idea. How do you make money? And so we know that this can be a sustainable, like long-term thing that we can depend on. So that's really important to us. And on the monetization side, we monetize through either open core companies, so companies that are venture backed that have an open source component and are generally like higher volume open source projects, they pay. And then enterprises, something that has been kind of interesting and eye-opening, and how I actually know there's a whole space around this, is that platform teams or internal tools teams, enterprises function very much the same as open source maintainers, but they're serving the engineers internally. So enterprises that use Dosu internally also pay, and that's our main revenue stream is from these platform teams.
So they're paying for the service and install, or are they paying for some amount of usage, or are they paying for something else?
Usage, and internally it's per seat. So how many people internally need access to Dosu?
So that's your main monetization scheme. Are there other ones?
That's the primary one as of right now. We haven't implemented these, but I have potentially interesting revenue opportunities. Every team depends on open source. And if Dosu is installed on the majority of your dependencies, how do we help bring that context into your workflows? And then maybe you can pay per dependency, and some of that money can go back to helping fund those projects themselves.
So we've had a lot of projects that have done that sort of work before on the podcast, things that are dependent. You back your stack was a good example of an early on one. So projects that go all the way down the chain. And that makes sense to me. That's more about spending the money which you have. The reason why I asked what your monetization scheme is because you're in a lot of debt right now, which you're going to have to pay back to your VC funders. That's how VC funding works, right? And just asking for seats at the table and paying for seats is one way of making money, but there's a lot more ways of making money in open source. And I was just curious how that was looking for you. Now that makes sense to me. And it makes sense in particular for me because I used to run a company that does something very similar. I just didn't have an AI. It was me who was doing it. So this was like maintainer.io, which I ran 9 years ago. It was actually always a fake front. I wanted to talk to corporate users. And so I had this offering, people could pay me $5 or something, and that would help maintain their repo per month. But I always knew that wasn't sustainable. What was sustainable was that people would get me in the door. Those conversations would help me talk to larger companies who would then pay me to be an advisor on open source and run as a sort of external OSPO. So that was Maintainer Mountaineer, which I haven't really used since joining Sustain, to be honest. So I feel like yours is like the next generation of that. I don't mean to toot my own horn, but it just sounds very similar. It sounds like something else that you're doing. Does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I read maintainer.io and I was like, this pitch is very similar. It's like, we've learned a lot from open source over the past 2 decades. How can we help bring that expertise to projects or internal teams that want to adopt those best practices and make them easy to adopt and enforce? And that's kind of where LLMs help, because they can pattern match similar to humans. And, a lot of what humans do is have memory and pattern match. And I think LLMs are well suited for that.
Cool. my next question, which is I burned out really fast because I didn't have the time to deal with everyone. And that makes sense. It's a bad idea having one person responding to every single person on a repo. Having an AI do that does make sense in the sense that, they have infinite amount of patience and time. They can deal with trolls. They can deal with people who are beginning and don't know what to do. And it's like, hey, read this part of the docs. It's actually quite useful. And a lot of what you're doing as a maintainer is formulaic. But in the same way that, I burnt out, the user has a response to being told something by a machine. What have you found in your work so far in the usage in the wild? How have users responded to having to interact with an AI as part of their open source contributorship?
Overall, I would say net positive. I think, with anything, you get a range of reactions. But I think if you take a step back and look at the state of open source, typically someone creates an issue and they don't hear back for hours, days, or years. And so when someone creates an issue and Dosu responds within minutes, the first time it interacts with someone, it'll explain why it's there. Within minutes of creating your issue, you now have a tool available to you that is able to kind of sift through the massive information within open source much more easily than you could. So that allows you to potentially resolve the issue yourself. Either you find what you're looking for, or a maintainer can then jump in and you've maybe done a first pass in the investigation. We don't want Dosu to replace maintainers. It's really a tool for communities, both on the maintainer side, so they have to do less of that repetitive work. And then on the contributor community side, they have a tool available to them immediately.
It's interesting that you say it's net positive. That goes against my knee-jerk response. And my knee-jerk response is also super crusty. I've interacted with things like GitHub Actions before, and it was never really a problem. I get kind of annoyed at GitHub Actions. But one of the things that keeps me in open source is actually working with other people. It being collaborative. It's working with maintainers. Have you heard intimations that maybe Dosu is making it harder to make those connections on a human level with other humans because it gets in the way?
I got into open source for very much the same reason. I got into open source because at the time was running a lot of open source projects on Kubernetes. And as one does running projects on Kubernetes, we ran into issues, had questions, they weren't documented. We were spending a lot of time searching through code on GitHub, trying to understand how things actually work, creating issues. And eventually I had some very positive interaction with maintainers, and they're like, hey, this is a great idea, or yes, this is a known issue. Can you fix it? And I was like, oh, I guess I can. And I made my first contribution, and it was a very positive interaction that reminded me kind of the nostalgic old internet in a lot of ways, where I had these positive interactions with random strangers on the internet. And that is what got me super excited about open source and, ultimately became a maintainer. And it's also part of the reason I really like being a maintainer. I think a lot of maintainers have that propensity to help people. I like unblocking someone. And so we want to preserve that. I think there's still room for automation. A lot of issues just are duplicates at the end of the day. GitHub makes it very hard to search across issues, PRs, maybe the information was a conversation that happened in Slack. So surfacing those low-hanging fruits, I think is net and win for maintainer and user. And then there are issues that are more high level about contributing a new feature. And if that feature has a place in kind of the scope of this project, and those types of issues are where maintainers should weigh in and, have that conversation with the user. Yes, this is a good idea. This is how maybe you think about implementing it, or no, it's not, because we want to keep the scope of this project very narrow.
Your comment that most issues are duplicates, or a lot of issues are duplicates. Your LLM-based software is only going to be able to respond based on what it's seeing. And so issues which look like duplicates but aren't duplicates are going to be totally just a failure for it, because it can't statistically deal with things that are slightly out of the realm of what it's already seen before. And a lot of open source work is technical and it is novel. So how does the system deal with that? And how do you talk to your customers about the issue that it won't get everything and that your tool isn't perfect and can never be perfect? How do you maintain expectations?
That is a really good question, and one we think a ton about. So on the kind of net new, one of the sweet spots actually for Dosu is when you have a similar but not exact issue, and the combination of that previous issue that's similar has a resolution plus code from the code base. The LLMs are actually like able to adapt like the previous issue plus the source code. And so that is actually like a sweet spot for us. There are things that are completely new and maybe it's not answerable by code, or the context like lives without the scope of what Dosu has access to, in which case we try to not respond. But where kind of like our general take on this problem of, LLMs are only as good as the information has available to it is how we have ended up kind of moving in this knowledge-based direction, where we've been surprised by maintainers and generally users' excitement and motivation to teach Dosu or train it, where they want to help prune and curate the knowledge that it has in order to make sure that it's like using high quality knowledge when it responds. We've been investing a lot in maintainer or human in the loop workflows, where maintainers can like review Dosu's responses, and it might not be perfect, but for them, it's actually like almost like a research tool where it did the first pass of searching through everything, finding relevant resources, and then they can finish it off with the last 10, 20% that maybe Dosu missed. And then if they publish that response, then saving that as like a FAQ in the knowledge base as like a kind of high quality knowledge for it to use in the future. So that's how we've been thinking about it, is like we want to put maintainers and users in control and have visibility into what Dosu like can and cannot do.
You said 10, 20% that it missed. What's your failure rate?
Good question. I would say with like general questions about a repository or duplicates, very high success rate generally. I would say in the 70 to 85% range. And then you get into kind of more complex multi-step bugs. And then, success can decrease from there. Sometimes a resolution on an issue or discussion doesn't actually have to be a precise answer. It might be enough to give someone something that is like 80 or 90% correct. And then they are like, oh, I'm missing XYZ. Enough to just unblock people or point them to something that they didn't see before, ends up still resolving the issue.
All right. So that makes sense to me as a tool. It makes sense that you can have the maintainer save it before responding. It makes sense that there's a 10 to 30 failure rate on the first pass, which is how I'm interpreting what you just said, followed by decreasing rates going down the complexity stack, which, to be honest, I have failure rates as a human too, and they're probably similar. I've so far been skirting around my biggest issue, which I'm just going to go right into, which is how on earth do you justify using a tool that uses LLM data? Because LLM data has been effectively scraped from other people. You are selling other people's work. And a lot of times that work has been work that they have licensed in ways saying, we don't want you to do this. It just hasn't gone to court yet. So you're in an ethical gray area using this tool, which also uses massive amount of environmental resources that our planet does not have. So how do you justify it to yourself? Not in a judging way, but like, how do you justify it to yourself using this tool? Why don't you do something else?
It's a good question. It's a hard question. I think about it a lot. On the kind of legal side and ethical side, in terms of like licensing and how these models were trained, that's a bit out of my wheelhouse, but I think it's something that I hope we as a community will kind of align on and fix over time. Like, I think that is something that is solvable. And the way that LLMs have been introduced, it kind of came as a surprise to a lot of people. I think that we will mature and there will be kind of more transparent licensing of like how these models were trained over time. And I think it's then on us to adopt models that are more fairly trained.
If it's out of your wheelhouse, why are you driving the car? It is in your wheelhouse because you're using these tools, right? You have to think about these things. I mean, your investors must have asked you what's going to happen, what's your failure plan if someone comes back from the Supreme Court and says that LLMs aren't legal. Did they ask you that question?
They actually didn't, but I think part of it is our positioning of like working directly with maintainers And I think it goes back to saying I was been surprised by people's willingness to invest in the tool. And my hope is that we have an opportunity to work with maintainers, generate very high quality data of like democratizing maintainer knowledge to a certain extent, and figure out, okay, given this information that we've collaborated to generate, like how do we then use that to better serve communities and users and make sure everyone's compensated as part of that? So that's our angle. But there are other model providers that are taking different approaches. And I think it's to be seen how that's all going to pan out.
So the LLM is a black box that you can't analyze because by the nature of how these things work, that's how LLMs generally work. You just mentioned democratizing knowledge. Now, obviously, the code base itself is some sort of commons. It's some sort of democratized knowledge. And also the documentation is as well. For the output that your LLM is making, is it always open source? It can't be legally because what it's fed on necessarily wasn't. And so you actually don't know the provenance of the data. But are you releasing it in the commons with the intention that it be licensed as an open source product, finding that eventually we get to some licensing agreement where that's the case? AKA, is it available, everything that you're producing? Or do you also produce documents that are only internal and only for the maintainer, and they decide whether it's published or not?
Interesting. So we have kind of a human loop publish flow. So there are comments and knowledge Dosu generates that has to be like explicitly approved or edited by maintainers. And this push to open up this knowledge base, which hopefully we'll be releasing in the coming months, is going to give a lot more transparency into just like the information we have available to Dosu.
What push?
Make it accessible to everyone. So right now, the way we talk about Dosu as like a living knowledge base, the way you interact with it is by asking questions. What we are going to is like helping actually surface that information on its like a dedicated website and like visualize all this information. So it's much more transparent into like what Dosu has access to.
I asked what push because it sounded like you were talking about users who've been asking it, or investors who've been asking it, or the market who's been asking for these things. Are any of those three true? Do you have a dialogue with your maintainers about how to best build the software in a way that matches what they want according to the licenses they want?
Yeah, we have community Slack, community Discord. We have a dedicated channel for Dosu and the CNCF Slack for CNCF maintainers in particular. So we have very active dialogue with our maintainers about how we should be building Dosu to best align with what they are looking for, and meet their needs. I think that's the only way we are successful too, is we build a product that's genuinely useful to maintainers and internal teams.
Do you have a disclaimer with every single AI message saying that this was generated by AI, and if you don't like it, you can fork your own project?
We don't have a disclaimer. We used to actually always have like a warning, generated by AI. But I think that was earlier on and people were less familiar with LLMs. I feel like people see Dosu, they know it's an LLM, and that carries a certain amount of caution.
So you no longer have a disclaimer on your thing saying it's AI. So people could interpret it as a person who's responding. It's not coming from the user's account. It's coming from a Dosu account.
Yes, it's coming from a Dosu bot. It's a GitHub app. So, it's fairly clear, but it could be misinterpreted.
Okay. What LLMs are you using in the background? What are you basing this off of?
We use a combination of models. So some kind of model providers.
Which ones?
OpenAI, Anthropic, and open source models as well. So, you can think of Dosu as it's a multi-step process to generate a response or do research as we describe it internally. So we use different models at different stages.
Okay. AIs, again, are based upon what they've seen. Open source is in no way a perfect environment. It's filled with privilege. It's filled with white male people who are educated and sometimes a bit somewhere on the spectrum, like me. I say that because I've been rude before and I didn't realize it. I was just being who I am. And it's also filled with people who have deeply embedded colonialist, racist, sexist views, like I do, because of where I grew up, that I have to work to undo. How are you working to ensure that your LLM doesn't respond based upon the views that it has? What are you doing to make sure that it's better? How are you employing moral philosophers at your business to help improve the AI? How are you employing people from the global south to help improve the AI? What are you doing to ensure that the responses are better than its input?
I think where you have to look at LLMs slightly differently, at least the way we approach it, is, like I was saying before, we're not trying to make Dosu replace maintainers or be treated like a human. We want it to be a tool. And so we want the responses to be, I would say, information first. Like we want the interactions with Dosu to be delightful, very positive, but we aren't trying to imbue too much of like humanness in its responses. Like we really want Dosu to surface information and be seen as a tool, not like as a person. And so I think that helps.
Well, why aren't you adding a disclaimer? Why aren't you saying clearly that this is AI? Because that seems to be the opposite of what you just said.
And not necessarily. You have GitHub Actions that post on a issue. Do you need a disclaimer saying like this is an automation?
Yes, there's like proven science. I was trying to find the name for the effect. I couldn't find it. Where people attribute personalities to AIs. They do that. It's a thing that we do. It's a reason why we had Tamagotchis, because we thought they were pets. It's a reason why Clippy is so gosh darn annoying. It's just a computer. There's no reason for it to be annoying. There really isn't. It's literally just code. But I still get annoyed every time I see even the visage of Clippy showing up anywhere. And in the same way, we do that with AIs. We do that as a function of being human. We see faces in trees. We see shapes in the clouds. So I'm curious, when you talk about we want it to be a delightful experience and we're just providing information, that's ignoring human psychology, which doesn't just do that. We interact with things in a given way. So what are you doing to make that better for people? So far, you said we're not going to have a disclaimer anymore. Okay, so that's a flag for me. So what are you doing internally at your company to ensure that things are better?
I think it's how you present information. You can think about the outputs that you're going to have from Dosu. It isn't as dynamic of a range as what you'll have with a human in terms of like controlling potential outputs. And I think the thing that LLMs do have going for it, or automation, is that it can have a consistent type of response at all times. It's not going to get angry because it's tired or frustrated. Users might get frustrated, but Dosu will remain fairly optimistic. And I think that is actually something that is kind of nice within open source in some ways.
Yeah, but Dosu won't remain optimistic because it doesn't have an internal state. And also responding the same way every time is going to be responding as if you're a well-educated white male who works in open source, because that's where the data comes from. Most of the time, if I have people who are part of an open source repository who are largely from a different background, let's say from the American South and they're African American, it's going to need to respond differently and it won't know how. And so I'm just curious, have you done anything internally about making sure that that responds appropriately in cases like this?
Well, we think a lot about what does it mean for Dosu to have a good response? Like, what does response quality mean? We spend a lot of time thinking about that. And there are some like quantitative elements to it around like conciseness. There's some psychology or NLP, like how you structure the response. You want the most important information first. You don't want the kind of support language preamble. And then there's the understanding of who you're talking to. I think there's a lot we can do to improve this for reasons like you described, as well as if you're just thinking about like open source, there is such a range of expertise just on who interacts with Dosu. And that's something that we have invested in and are continuing to, is like the response that a super technical engineer who has been on this repository many times has already made contributions. What they're expecting from Dosu is much more in-depth than someone who maybe is new to Python. This is their first GitHub issue they've ever created. And they're looking for a different type of response. And so we try to take that into account as well. Just one other point on this that I think's kind of cool. There are questions about like how these models are trained is a bit of a black box, but they are really good at multilingual, and open source is very global. And so something that people like is that Dosu can actually engage with them in their native language if the underlying model's been trained on that. So whether it's Chinese, Spanish, Portuguese, we've seen people like be excited that they can use their native language to interact with Dosu in a way that a maintainer like probably doesn't speak 7 different languages. So there are some benefits to LLMs being inherently multilingual.
So this is my favorite question that I want to ask. All these questions have been hard, and thank you for sitting with me. And even when you haven't answered them as gracefully as I would like, I'm so grateful that you're answering them. So thank you. I love that you have multilingual capabilities. That is dope. That is like my favorite thing. It's the thing I talk about all the time on this podcast, just because I have a linguistics background and I care for other languages, and I think it's awesome. Of course, it's going to be the main standardized version of those languages. It's not going to be whatever variant people are speaking, because languages aren't monolithic things. They're not a complete thing. The English that you're speaking is different than the English I'm speaking, even though it's pretty similar. When a user feels joy when they see it in their language, they're feeling a response to a technical product. And that response is going towards Dosu, which is a bot. It's not necessarily going towards the product. It's not necessarily going towards the maintainers. And so what happens is that this emotion has nothing to tie it to interrelationally. And humans only work interrelationally. We kind of talked about this earlier. We stay in a place because we want to be with the people in that place. That's why we do anything. Don't you feel that using a GitHub bot / an AI companion, as you might sell it to an investor, any range of ways of looking at Dosu, ultimately poisons the community you're trying to make by taking away those interactions and unembedding them from the technical web of socialness that we have? There's probably a better way for me to say it, but I hope you understand what I'm getting at, which is that you're removing the possibility of those feelings becoming part of an actual relationship that the people may have with a product. And over the long term, that may lead to detrition in terms of user rates of joining a project. Have you thought about that?
Yes. This was a fundamental decision we made early on about how we designed Dosu. And you actually look at a lot of products in this space, a lot of them are focused on pull request generation. So I'm going to take a GitHub issue, I'm going to generate a pull request. Our take has always been and still is, we want to help a human or a user, a member of the community, create that PR, not Dosu. If Dosu generates it, great, that thing gets done. But if that user is able to generate that PR and becomes invested in the community, they then have that interaction with the maintainer on reviewing the PR. Like, actually, you want to change this. They have a back and forth. They can feel like they were actually able to contribute, have a sense of belonging in that community. And then hopefully that encourages them to contribute more and maybe follow a similar journey that I and many other maintainers had, which is like you start contributing and eventually help becoming a maintainer. So our angle has always been like, how do we empower people to help become contributors? And a certain amount of interactions that are now happening with a machine that previously was a human. But I think that maintainers are stretched already. And I don't think all of these interactions, especially for the low-hanging fruit questions, trying to find reference PRs, like a human doesn't have to be in that. But for someone to contribute, I think it's really important to have that interaction with the maintainer along the way. So that's how we think about it.
Finally, do you offer any advice to your users or to your customers around using AI in the face of our overwhelming climate crisis, where AI has a huge amount of environmental response? How do you deal with that?
I think it's a very important question. Right now, LLMs are really new technology. We're in this period of kind of abundance. It has happened very quickly. There's a lot of experimentation happening. And I think over time, we'll kind of reach a more sustainable equilibrium. At least that's my hope. And I also hope that it forces us as a society to find more cleaner and renewable ways of supporting these workloads. I think there's also a lot of just optimization to be had on LLMs. Like, it's fairly new. And I think with optimizations, things can become more efficient and more sustainable over the long term.
All right. That's Devin Stein of Dosu. You can find Dosu online at dosu.dev. Devin, do you also have a blog or social media presence that you want to highlight or pitch?
I think I'm on Twitter at devstein, DEVSTIN 64.
Cool. And you can find those in the show notes as well. Thank you, Devin. Don't leave yet. At the end of every show, we have a bit called Spotlight, where we highlight other people, projects, or things that we think are just particularly awesome. and that we want to share. I don't know if I've shared this one yet. I just really like Avatar: The Last Airbender. Like every time I get sick, I just watch it over and over again. And my partner has been feeling a bit under the weather recently. And so I've been sort of side-eyeing it from the other side of the kitchen while I'm doing work. And just massive shout out to everyone involved with Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's a way better show than Avatar, the movie, which you can also talk about at length with me. Just, Flamio Hotman, let's go. And Devin, tell me about your spotlight today.
That is a hard one to follow. I love Avatar: The Last Airbender. I've also watched it as a child in adulthood, and I rewatched it with my partner, and we might rewatch it again. It's phenomenal. It just makes me feel good. My spotlight is for a project called sqlc, which I've been using for a long time now. It helps you generate type-safe code from SQL queries. So it's really, really nice if you have a small project or some internal service that you don't need a fully fledged ORM for. You just write SQL queries, and then it'll generate all the client-side code you need to interact with the database. It's really nice because you can write SQL queries and then generate Go code, Python code, TypeScript, whatever language it's in. And I also have had a lot of, on kind of the theme of open source maintenance, a lot of really good interactions with Kyle Gray, one of the maintainers and creators.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you, listeners, for coming on this podcast. It's been great to have you with us. If you have been with us and you got it this long, this is the end of the part where I talk like I'm from a medical commercial, but it's all really important stuff. So first off, go to opencollective.com/SustainOSS and donate to this project. We always need more money for this podcast because it is not free. And we would enjoy, if you enjoyed listening to it, maybe $5 would be great, just like you would pay for a movie. Secondly, give us any response you got. Email podcast@sustainoss.org. That goes to all the hosts. Email me at richard@sustainoss.org. Feel free to complain. Tell me I should have asked harder questions. I'm totally okay with hearing that. I would love to hear that. Also, you can reach out on our social medias where we're on Mastodon, we're on Blue Sky, we're on LinkedIn. And of course, we're on our Discourse at discourse@sustainoss.org. And you can always go, of course, finally, to podcast@sustainoss.org. There may be a theme. It's always SustainOSS. I wonder why that is. And you can check out the show notes, find the links, look up Devin's stuff. Go to dosu.dev if you're curious and learning more about Dosu. And thank Devin for coming on this podcast at all. Devin, it's been great to have you. I really appreciate having you being here. I think it's an interesting tool. I'm not sure I'll use it, mainly because I'm not really a maintainer who has overload issues because I've set up really hard boundaries for myself. But I can see its usage. So just thank you for coming on. Good luck and take care.
Thank you so much, Richard.